Hello everyone! If you enjoy these rare World War II chronicles, hit that subscribe button and leave a comment below telling us what city or country are you watching from. Let's get started.
By the spring of 1944, the Red Army had succeeded in pushing German forces back from Leningrad. Crimea and a significant portion of Soviet Ukraine had been liberated. The front line remained almost unchanged only in Belorussia. Here, the positions of the German Army Group Center protruded far forward, forming a massive Belarusian balcony. During the winter of 1944, Soviet troops unsuccessfully attempted to attack German fortifications head-on. As a result, they failed not only to break through to Minsk, but even to capture Vitebsk. These failures became the subject of an investigation by a special commission of the State Defense Committee. Based on its findings, the Western Front was divided into two, the Second and Third Belarusian fronts. This restructuring improved command efficiency and brought headquarters closer to the specific sectors for which they were directly responsible. Additionally, Joseph Stalin replaced the leadership of all Belarusian fronts. General Konstantin Rokossovsky was appointed the new commander of the First Belarusian Front. In turn, the Second and Third Belarusian fronts were led by energetic army commanders who had distinguished themselves during the winter campaign, Generals Zakharov and Chernyakhovsky. The Soviet command faced a dilemma, whether to conduct an offensive in Ukraine or deliver the main blow in Belorussia. An offensive in Ukraine seemed most enticing, as success there would immediately open the way for the Red Army to advance into Poland and Romania. However, in that scenario, advancing Soviet troops would face a real threat of a flank attack from the balcony, where the deeply echeloned defense of the German Army Group Center was located. Consequently, the Stavka, High Command, decided to launch an offensive in Belorussia to eliminate the Belarusian salient and crush Army Group Center. Success would open a direct road to the west and simultaneously create a real threat to the flanks of the German Army Groups North and North Ukraine. The operation was named Bagration in honor of the famous general of the Patriotic War of 1812. The plan developed by the Stavka involved several powerful, deep strikes by four fronts to break through the German defense simultaneously in 6 directions. First, the groupings on the flanks of Army Group Center, near Vitebsk and Bobruisk, were to be encircled. By punching holes in the line, the army could advance on Minsk, cutting off the retreat routes to the east for the German 4th Field Army.
In total, 1.2 million personnel, 4,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, and over 5,000 combat aircraft were involved in the operation across the 4 fronts. The ambitious task required a rejection of formulaic solutions. On the southern flank, Rokossovsky proposed delivering not one, but 2 simultaneous main strikes toward Bobruisk and Slutsk. Stalin considered such a dispersal of forces very risky. However, Rokossovsky stood his ground. Ultimately, Stalin approved the plan, noting that the commander's persistence proved the offensive's organization was thoroughly considered, which served as a reliable guarantee of success. Preparation for Operation Bagration was kept in the strictest secrecy. Any information leak could result in failure. The Germans could quickly transfer reserves to Belorussia from other fronts. Soviet units maintained total radio silence. The movement of equipment and troops to the front line took place only in the dead of night. In the rear, troops actively trained for the coming battles on terrain models that exactly replicated the German defenses.
At the same time, Adolf Hitler did not expect a large-scale offensive on the Belarusian sector. The Wehrmacht command believed Soviet troops would continue to advance in Ukraine to try to cut off Army Groups Center and North from Germany. Economic factors also played a role. If the Romanian oil fields were lost, Germany would lose its only source of oil. For these reasons, Hitler decided to transfer significant forces out of Belorussia, reinforcing Army Group North Ukraine on the southern part of the front. Nevertheless, over the years of occupying Belorussia, the Germans had created a deeply echeloned defense consisting of several lines up to 250 kilometers deep. The heavily forested and swampy terrain, difficult for tanks to navigate, also worked in their favor. By June 1944, Army Group Center comprised 4 armies, occupying a front 1,100 kilometers long. The total German strength, including rear units, was about 900,000 men, armed with 10,000 guns and mortars, 900 tanks, and over 1,300 combat aircraft. Ultimately, the German generals failed to decipher the Soviet command's intent. Furthermore, the commander of Army Group Center, Field Marshal Busch, went on leave 3 days before the start of Operation Bagration. On June 22, 1944, Soviet troops conducted a reconnaissance in force, and the following day began the assault on Vitebsk. Units of the 1st Baltic and 3rd Belarusian fronts were tasked with catching the Germans in a giant pincer movement. However, artillery batteries located in the German rear prevented an immediate collapse of the defenses. Heavy howitzer fire slowed the advance of the Soviet lead units. Consequently, IL-2 ground attack aircraft were deployed to suppress the German batteries. Wehrmacht soldiers nicknamed them Butchers for the effectiveness of their low-altitude strikes. Once the enemy batteries were silenced, Soviet infantry and tanks surged forward. Upon receiving the first reports from Belarus, Hitler categorically forbade his troops to retreat, and Vitebsk was declared a fortress city. However, the Germans could not fulfill his order. On the 3rd day of battle, troops from 2 Soviet fronts met on the banks of the western Dwina. Vitebsk was completely surrounded. By the 5th day, German units surrendered. 17,000 soldiers and officers were taken prisoner, including the commander of the 53rd Army Corps, General Gollwitzer. The destruction of the Wehrmacht at Vitebsk left a 150-kilometer gap in the German lines. The northern flank of Army Group Center was effectively destroyed. On June 24, 1944, Rokossovsky's 1st Belarusian front went on the offensive on the southern flank. Advancing through swamps deemed impassable, Soviet tanks struck where they were least expected. The maneuver even surprised some Soviet generals. General Batov later recalled, "German generals believed the topographical symbol for impassable swamp and succumbed to the comforting thought that we could never attack through the marshy mires." The defense of the 9th Army near Bobruisk was breached within hours. Soviet tanks and cavalrymen from the mechanized group of General Isa Plyev rushed into the gap. Rokossovsky's calculation for 2 strikes at Bobruisk proved correct. The only tank division in Army Group Center, the 20th Panzer Division, was initially sent to block the Soviet advance near Rogachev. However, the success of the 2nd Soviet strike group forced the Germans to change plans. Attempting to close the breach with only 1 division led to failure and heavy losses of equipment during the march. Soon, the defense at Rogachev also crumbled. By the morning of June 27th, Soviet tank corps met north of Bobruisk, closing the ring around the German 9th Army. Within 2 days, the encircled group was liquidated. Rokossovsky's troops captured over 23,500 men. On June 28th, the Stavka ordered the 1st and 3rd Belarusian fronts to advance toward the capital of Soviet Belorussia in a synchronized pincer movement. General Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army was to play the decisive role. Meanwhile, stunned by the rapid Soviet advance, surviving German units began a chaotic retreat toward Minsk. This withdrawal became a road of death for the Germans. Columns of equipment bottlenecked at the Berezina River, where only one bridge remained under Wehrmacht's control. Soviet ground attack aircraft dominated the skies, hounding the retreating columns with bombs and rockets. The scene mirrored the summer of 1941, but this time it was the Germans who were being encircled and crushed at river crossings. Simultaneously, Belarusian partisans turned the German retreat into a nightmare. During Operation Bagration, they carried out 60,000 rail sabotages, effectively paralyzing German rail traffic. To restore the collapsing front, Hitler dismissed Ernst Busch and appointed Walter Model. Model threw the well-equipped 5th Panzer Division, reinforced by a heavy Tiger Battalion, against Rotmistrov's army. This slowed the Soviet tankers' advance on Minsk, causing dissatisfaction among the high command. However, despite the lack of the newest T-34-85 tanks in some units, the Germans suffered significant losses and lost all their heavy Tiger tanks. On the dawn of July 3, tanks of General Berdani's 2nd Guards Tank Corps entered Minsk. By midday, tanks of the 1st Guards Tank Corps burst in from the southeast. By the end of the day, Minsk was cleared of German troops. The link-up of the two fronts meant the encirclement of the remnants of 3 German armies was complete. By July 11th, the Germans ceased resistance. 35,000 soldiers and officers were taken prisoner. In just 2 weeks, the Red Army destroyed 7 Army Corps and 28 divisions of Army Group Center. Soviet troops continued westward. On July 13th, Vilnius was liberated. In the north, units reached the Baltic Sea. In the south, the Second Belarusian Front reached the pre-war borders of the USSR. On July 28th, the Red Army liberated Brest and the legendary Brest Fortress. By early August, the First Belarusian Front reached the Vistula and stood at the gates of Warsaw. Operation Bagration had achieved its goals, with the Red Army advancing over 600 kilometers. The successes were so staggering that the West doubted their veracity. In response, on July 17, 1944, a column of 57,000 German prisoners, including 20 generals, was marched through the streets of Moscow. Water trucks followed the prisoners, symbolically washing the defeated invaders' traces from the asphalt.
On July 18th, Rokossovsky's troops began the Lublin-Brest operation. They broke through near Kovel, crossed the Western Bug, and entered Poland. General Bogdanov's 2nd Guards Tank Army captured Lublin after a 2-day storm. Politically, Stalin intended to use Lublin as a base for a loyal Polish government, the Polish Committee of National Liberation. Following the liberation of Lublin, Rokossovsky ordered the 2nd Tank Army to seize crossings over the Vistula and advance toward Warsaw. However, the Germans offered fierce resistance to gain time. Warsaw was defended by elite SS divisions and remnants of retreating groups. On July 27th, Soviet troops crossed the Vistula near Puławy, and on August 1st, General Chuykov's 8th Guards Army seized a bridgehead at Magnushev. On August 1st, 1944, the Warsaw Uprising broke out, organized by the Home Army and the Polish government in exile in London. It began just hours after the Soviet 2nd Tank Army had been forced into a defensive posture by powerful German counterattacks. The Soviet troops were exhausted after a 600-kilometer fighting march. They were short on ammunition and fuel, and their air support had not yet relocated to forward airfields. Under Warsaw, the Germans concentrated 52,000 men and 600 tanks,
while the lead Soviet tank army had only 32,000 men and 425 tanks. Attacking from three sides, the Germans encircled the 3rd Tank Corps of General Vedeneev near Rodzimin. Although the corps broke out to its own lines by August 4th, the Soviet offensive momentum was spent. There was no question of taking Warsaw by storm. Despite the difficult situation, the Soviet command provided aid. Planes bombed German positions and dropped weapons and food to the insurgents. However, the uprising was suppressed on October 2. Because the insurgents did not coordinate their actions with the Red Army, they were effectively doomed.
The Red Army captured the Prague district, eastern Warsaw, on September 14th, but the city was fully liberated only 4 months later during the Vistula-Oder offensive. On January 17, 1945, the First Belarusian Front finally cleared the city. In total, about 200,000 Soviet soldiers died in the battles for the Warsaw direction. This refutes the claims by some modern politicians that the Red Army stood idly by while the uprising perished. Operation Bagration inflicted the greatest defeat in German military history, crushing a 1 million-man army group and shortening the war by months.